to Lecture 2. In our previous lecture, we began talking about the difficulty of defining exactly what myth is and how it functions. In this lecture and in lecture number 3, we're going to continue our discussion of what myth is and how it can be defined, and in particular, we're going to look at several of the most influential theories about myth that developed in the 19th and 20th centuries. Now, as I said in the previous lecture, the question, what is myth, has no easy or obvious answer. One thing that we can dispense with right away is the usage of the term myth in popular speech to mean a lie or a misconception or a mistaken belief. That doesn't concern us here. For instance, if someone says love at first sight is just a myth, what they mean by that is something along the lines of that's a mistaken belief, a misconception, it doesn't really happen. That's a very common usage of the term myth, but clearly that's not what we're dealing with here. Despite the fact that myth is so difficult to define precisely, most people seem to have a sense that there is such a category as myth, that we're not just chasing a chimera here, but there is such a category as myth, and most people have the sense that they know it when they see it, that when we are told a story or read a story that is a myth, we somehow sense a difference in that from other kinds of stories that we may be told or that we may read. We can begin to try to close in on what myth is, what that difference is between myth and other forms of story, how we know it when we see it, by identifying some characteristics of myth to supplement the working definition that I gave you in the previous lecture. If you'll remember, that definition started by saying that myths are traditional stories or traditional tales that a society tells. Let's think about the implications of the term traditional tales. Myths are tales. Myths are stories. That may seem so obvious that it doesn't need to be said, but it is worth focusing on just for a second. There are many forms of human communication that are not stories. Even if they follow a logical narrative order, they're not stories. These lectures, for instance, I hope follow a logical narrative order, but they're not stories, despite the fact that they are communication. Myth is story. If something is not a story, it's not a myth. And I would push that far enough to say that a representation of a myth in artwork is just that, a representation of a myth in artwork. This behind me is a representation of the birth of Venus, or Aphrodite in her Greek name. It's not the myth of the birth of Aphrodite. So myths are stories, and they are traditional stories. I touched on that pretty thoroughly in the last